Okay. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone joining us for today's webinar on communicating data for maximum impact. We're going to dive right in. We've got a lot to cover during this hour as usual, and we always like to leave a little time at the end for your questions. This is Meg Sansevero with Marketing for Change speaking. And first, I'm going to quickly cover a couple of housekeeping items. So one, as a participant, you should be on mute by default, but please double check that your mic on Zoom is muted as a courtesy to everyone here. Great, thank you for doing that. And two, we are planning time at the end for a Q&A. If you do have questions for our presenter throughout the presentation, please type that question into the box marked Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So it's specifically marked Q&A, it is from the chat box. And we'll do our best to answer as many of those questions as we can within the time that we have. And lastly, this webinar is being recorded. After we're done today, a link to the recording and a group of handouts will be made available to everyone who is here, as well as everybody who registered and may be unable to attend or have to leave us early. Okay, next slide, please. Today's event marks the 6th of 6 webinars. So our last webinar in this Amplify series. The series is designed to help health officials increase their capacity to effectively communicate the public health impacts of climate change and help communities prepare and respond. It's being led by behavior change communication experts at Marketing for Change, and it's supported through a cooperative agreement with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's Climate and Health Program. We want to thank them for making this opportunity available to all of the Climate Ready states and cities grantees and their partners. And we're especially grateful to the grantees who lead the communications community of practice for helping us bring this opportunity to life. All right. Without further ado, today's speaker is Jennifer Kresslake. She's the Associate Director of Research in Social Marketing and Communication at FHI 360. Dr. Kresslake is a social scientist and epidemiologist specializing in climate and health. She has led studies to identify effective messaging frames for communication materials that address the health impacts of climate change and to measure perceptions of public health interventions addressing climate change among residents of communities across the U.S. affected by increasingly extreme weather. She is also published on the roles of health professionals in climate change prevention and preparedness, written on the need for documentation of climate impacts in tropical and subtropical regions, and collaborated on descriptive studies of knowledge and risk perceptions of climate and health among the American public as well as health professionals. So welcome, Dr. Kresslake, and without further ado, I'll let you take over.
Thank you for the introduction, Meg, and thank you to everyone for joining today's webinar. This webinar is for anyone who collects, has access to, or works with health data or other data related to climate change in their region. So today we'll be discussing how to look to your data that you may already work with or have access to, and consider ways to compile and translate data into information to engage members of the lay public and other stakeholders in your work. Today's webinar is divided into 3 sections. In the first section, we will cover how to identify and pull together data that will resonate in communities you work in. In the second section, we will present how to use these data to tell stories about local climate impacts. And in the third, we'll cover how to consolidate the data that you have into key points that are easily understood and disseminated within your community. In the following section, we will not be focusing on data collection, as that is an entire research methods course potentially, but rather we're operating under the assumption that many of you already collect data or work with data sets that are relevant to climate and health, and that you may be asked to use or want to use to convey climate impacts to key audiences in the communities you serve. In the next few slides, we will talk about what types of data best address key community concerns. You'll notice here that we have divided common concerns into two categories: what is happening and what are the solutions. Anytime one is communicating about people being at risk, there also needs to be information that empowers them to make decisions to protect themselves and participate in protecting their communities. So we'll start with some slides about data regarding what is happening. The more intense and frequent extreme weather is one of the most observable aspects of climate change currently affecting U.S. communities. People in your community may already be noticing and wondering if weather events are getting worse in their local area than they remember in years past. And your data can help people place the extreme weather events that they experience into a bigger picture. So on this slide, we have examples of extreme weather indicators that can provide evidence of these changes, which can be especially compelling if compared over time. And these indicators were selected because they provide examples of the consequences of extreme weather. This information goes beyond descriptive information about extreme weather, such as inches of rainfall or record temperatures, which sometimes feels a little out of context for folks. But these data can be compared year to year to help people see whether these consequences of extreme weather are becoming more common. Surveys of the U.S. public indicate that Americans do have a general sense that climate impacts are quote-unquote bad for health, but they're frequently unable to name specific health consequences. So city, county, or state level public health surveillance data can be used to give people an idea of the prevalence or incidence of these impacts, including how they're changing over time or vary by geographic region. So for this, you have some choices. You can use measures of healthcare utilization as indicators of health impacts. A particularly good one is emergency department visits or hospitalizations due to heat exposure. And there are actually a number of ICD-10 codes for health conditions that are attributable to various types of extreme weather if you have access to that type of healthcare utilization data. You might also consider using quantified estimates of exposures that lead to poor health outcomes. On the upper right quadrant, this number of unhealthy days for sensitive groups is an example. You can provide a monthly or yearly comparison of the number of unhealthy air quality days. Another example that's not on this slide is, you might provide data on the presence of disease vectors such as ticks or mosquitoes that have expanded into new geographic ranges, and those are related to exposures. But the most straightforward data, if you have it available, are those that describe changes in the prevalence or incidence of actual health conditions that are known to be attributable to climate impacts. So for one thing, for example, it's one thing in that example I just gave about, showing expanded geographic range of disease vectors. But presenting evidence of the increased incidence of reported cases of Lyme disease due to this migration can help audiences connect the dots about direct health consequences that are linked to climate change. On the bottom right, mortality from extreme weather events is a commonly reported data point, and it's important for keeping the public informed. And we'll discuss later in this webinar how to place these numbers in context to properly convey their magnitude. We know that some people have higher social, medical, and geographic vulnerability to climate impacts, and these vulnerabilities frequently cluster. So climate change vulnerability assessments performed in your region will usually include some of these measures. So many of you will already have data compiled on, for example, the proportion of the population living in neighborhoods that are high on CDC's Social Vulnerability Index. Community leaders, health professionals, and other stakeholders in your community are interested in how many people will be affected, who they are, where they live, so that stakeholders can develop interventions and allocate resources to adaptation efforts. So if you have estimates of the prevalence of certain chronic conditions in your community, or the proportion of people living in high-risk conditions, such as crowded housing or on floodplains, You can use these to draw key audiences' attention to the need for adaptation efforts to prevent poor health outcomes across potentially large vulnerable swaths of the population. And as for the public, I recommend developing targeted messages for vulnerable community members about their risk factors so that they have information that will help them take protective action. Other messages, however, should also be developed simultaneously to make it clear that ultimately everyone is affected by climate change impacts, even though some with, for example, chronic conditions or geographic risk have excess vulnerability. Actually, I will go back to just making a final point about this. How much people understand about the health impacts of climate change and how at risk they personally feel will vary according to individual characteristics. So there will be people who underestimate their risk and therefore they do need information about what's happening. On the other hand, it's worth keeping in mind that research suggests that some members of the public who are more vulnerable to climate impacts already have heightened risk perceptions of this issue. They might already be there in terms of perceiving the risk. And that's why it's important not just to elevate feelings of fear or vulnerability, which may already be quite high for some people, but also to include data about what is being done and what can still be done, which helps to strengthen confidence and prevent complacency or a sense of helplessness about this huge issue that's, that climate change is. These are examples of data points that can be communicated to stakeholder audiences, certainly, to help them understand the current state of public readiness to extreme weather and other hazards among individuals and households. So these are individual and household level measures of preparedness that you can use to assess at a community level potentially how prepared individuals or households are. And this slide is a continuation of the last slide with some additional individual and household level indicators. In addition to communicating these to stakeholders, a potentially impactful use of these data when communicating to the public is to use them to leverage the power of people's perceptions of social norms. We know that people's belief that everyone else is practicing a behavior, or even that a behavior is socially approved, is often strongly associated with their increased likelihood of performing that behavior themselves. So if you find that your data reveal that a desired behavior, such as, say, developing a household evacuation plan, is growing among segments of your population, residents in your community, you may wish to create some messages about this, because this can establish such behavior as a social norm that is gaining traction in your community, and it can encourage everyone to do the same for their own households. In this slide, there are a few indicators at the community level, which can serve a similar function as the individual and household level measures on the previous slides, except that they indicate more collective efforts toward climate change adaptation or mitigation. You can use these data in at least a few ways. First, you can use these data to point stakeholders, again, toward areas where promising interventions are happening, or perhaps more to the point, need to happen. It may help to compare how your community is performing against other communities on these metrics. If the data demonstrate that your community is falling behind, that's potentially a very compelling story that you can tell about, how things can be improved to sort of keep up with others in the region. Second, you can use these data to gain interest from sectors you hope to be working with. For example, you can use data about, let's say, the item on the lower right, the number of restaurants participating in food waste reduction efforts. You can create messages about this if your data revealed that this number is, increasing, or or you sort of are noticing an uptick. You can create messages about this becoming an increasingly common norm, which may serve to motivate other restaurants, cafeterias, hospitality providers, and similar sectors to adopt the same practices in order to remain competitive or socially acceptable. And finally, I would strongly encourage communicating these measures to show evidence of community adaptation and mitigation efforts, particularly when they're showing positive momentum back to the public. While we certainly want to encourage individuals to be empowered by practicing individual or household level behaviors themselves, as we showed in the previous slides, we're learning that sometimes people can feel that these actions are too small in the face of something as large and potentially overwhelming as global climate change. And it's potentially very encouraging for community residents to see evidence that local or regional actions are occurring to get ahead on this issue. So whenever you find data that measure the progress of community efforts, then I would encourage you to track it and communicate about it, because it helps maintain momentum and it protects against feelings of fatalism and complacency in the public. So far, we've been talking about quantitative data, often obtained from surveys or public health surveillance efforts. You can complement these data with more qualitative or community-driven methods as well. These approaches can help to ensure that voices of community members and their experiences with climate impacts are incorporated into your messaging. So you may consider conducting or partnering with others to conduct focus groups, in-depth interviews, observational studies, or content analysis to obtain rich qualitative data that provides sort of a backstory to your quantitative data, exploring the hows and whys to explain what is occurring. And you might consider bringing together community members and researchers to do a joint project using community-based participatory research, where community members work with researchers to conceptualize a study to answer specific questions about climate impacts in their community. Then they collect data and are either trained to analyze the data or help the researcher with interpretation. This simultaneously generates very interesting data to help that you might not have thought to look for without community input. And it brings community members closer to the issue through the process of being involved in this project. Some popular CVPR projects are content analysis, for example, of news articles or social media posts. Community participants can also use a method called Photovoice, or a more modern equivalent, it has been increased to video voice, which entails going out to gather data in the form of photographs or videos, documenting phenomena in their community, and then coming together with researchers to describe what the photos convey, which are then used to identify emergent takeaway themes that you can use in your messaging. So this is an example of a photo voice project conducted with farmers on small family farms regarding climate change impacts on their farms. So using photos, these farmers documented issues or events on their farm relating to a changing climate. And this list on the left, in the upper left, is a compilation of the themes that farmers identified when, after they'd all taken their photos, they came together in focus groups and spent them reviewing the photos with the researchers. The photo, for example, on the upper right represents changes in rainfall and temperature. And this photo in the middle, at the top, are actually fire ants. And the one on the upper right is damage from heavy precipitation, and that was conceptualized and fell under the theme of rainfall and temperature changes. The fire ants were, classified under a theme of pests and invasive species, and again, sort of not only documenting these changes, but also coming together and identifying sort of key themes that farmers are seeing helps both researchers with understanding what is going on, but also you could use this in messaging and intervention development as well. You can also engage community members in data collection by setting up a citizen science project. This is like crowdsourcing data from community members. People can document climate change indicators in their local settings and send them to you, either as one-time data points or as part of an ongoing surveillance project. And once you get the instrument set up, this data collection method has the potential to collect a large amount of data quite rapidly. And there's even a federal website set up to list your citizen science project and recruit members of the public to participate in data collection according to your inclusion criteria. And this is a great way to get data that might be impractical for researchers to collect, but it also allows you to tell a compelling story about a collective effort to measure changing conditions in communities. The next section will contain pointers to help people understand your data when you use it in your communication efforts. So all of the data we've discussed in the previous section can be very powerful, but there are a few considerations when using data in your communication to target audiences. And I'll talk a bit more about members of the public as and target audiences defined within those, but you might know some of your audiences really well, and those might include your current partners or partners you wish to work with, community leaders, policymakers, and other stakeholders. You might already have an idea of what some of their priorities are, and I want to highlight the importance of developing messages for these viewers as opposed to a one-size-fits-all message. And to take that point further, when thinking about members of the public, a very good rule of thumb is never to assume that there is a message that will uniformly appeal to everyone. Always start by defining target audiences within that public. And for climate change, you may need to emphasize certain data and associated messages differently according to an individual or neighborhood's risk of experiencing climate impacts. So some of the ways to define your target audiences according to risk are listed here. And they're likely familiar to many of you. But you may also think of other ways to define target audiences, just depending on the communities you work with, that go beyond risk factors. Once you have your target audiences defined, you can move on to being purposeful in your presentation of data. What are you using the data for? So, the first might just be to describe a problem. And in that case, descriptive data can be illustrative, as long as you have some kind of narrative or, context to explain the numbers that you present. Second, are you using data to encourage audiences to take action? And if so, this is where some of the indicators that we discussed earlier can come in handy, because it provides specific things that are being done and can be done. Your data about vulnerability to climate impacts, for example, can increase perceptions of risk, and your indicators of individual, household, and community adaptation and mitigation efforts can increase efficacy beliefs. That is, confidence that that either individuals or communities can successfully perform behaviors to reduce vulnerability and act on climate change issues. And third, are you telling a broader story? People remember stories and they talk about stories, so this is a recommended strategy. You can bring the story that you see in your data. As somebody who works with data, you likely see the data or the story spelled out, but you can really bring it to life to non-researchers, people who are not working with data, by having community members tell illustrative anecdotes in testimonial styles. So you could do a video, you could do print with, a photo of a community member or somebody representing the community, and have kind of a narrative that accompanies that. This really helps audiences to connect emotionally to the phenomenon you're trying to convey with your data. And you can use images of people to help audiences visualize what is happening. Whenever possible, I recommend using photographs of people, and especially of people who, while they're experiencing health consequences found in your data, rather than abstract symbols or illustrations. And if you must use illustrations, because sometimes photographs are hard to come by, I would encourage you to make them as realistic as possible and not, stick figures or something too abstract. Something that allows your audiences to connect with the characters, or the community members being represented. You can also use images to show the progression of the phenomenon over time, and many of you have likely seen this, such as illustrating over time how sea level rise has caused the shoreline to slowly encroach upon communities each decade, for example. So on the last, we're on to the last section, and I just wanted to provide some tips to focus your audiences on key takeaways. So in earlier slides, I mentioned adding qualitative data to complement your quantitative data. Some of you will be starting with qualitative data, which is certainly encouraged, and sometimes people unfamiliar with the purpose and utility and value of qualitative data will dismiss it as anecdotal or say it reflects the views of only a small number of people. And if you wish, you can provide a few data points from population-based data sets to triangulate information from the story told through qualitative data. And again, qualitative data is very effective for telling a story, but you know, sometimes having some key data points really helps to bring that point home. And I would say definitely take care to ensure that your qualitative data include experiences of people who share socioeconomic, cultural, or racial and ethnic characteristics with members of your target audience. This helps to prevent the story being told through qualitative data from being dismissed because the viewer doesn't identify with the people being described or portrayed. When people find a message to be threatening or dramatic or conflicting with a different narrative that they hope is true, they might suggest that you're using scare tactics or express skepticism about the veracity of your message. And while you don't need to unpack all of your methods like you would to more scientific audiences, you can show images or video or a simple list of steps about how qualitative data were gathered, where the data came from. Note that qualitative data are reviewed using a systematic process involving multiple analysts, so it doesn't reflect the opinion of one person. And obviously you're not going to show video of focus groups that are confidential, but if you can show for example, with the CVPR project, if you can show the community member researchers coding data together or taking photos together, I think that that's a potentially nice way of being very transparent about methods in a compelling way. Making sure that you follow principles of data presentation for quantitative data can help to ensure that any numbers you provide are helpful instead of distracting. Whenever possible, I would recommend presenting your data in relative terms. Don't provide numbers without grounding them in a denominator or a time frame. When communicating with non-scientific audiences, really avoid getting bogged down in statistical language, even if it's your instinct to include qualifiers and further statistical explanation. I would say place it in a footnote so that you don't overwhelm or lose, or lose the lay viewer. Target audiences also will want to place themselves or their family members in something of, you could think of it as a continuum of risk. You can organize your data to help audiences find themselves and understand where they fall pretty quickly. So, for example, you can group data according to quickly identifiable risk groups where people will be able to see themselves. Do I have that health condition? I might fall here in terms of risk. Is it a household with children? That would cause a viewer with children to potentially attend to your message more closely. To portray geographic risk, many of you already do likely make use of maps, and designing them in a way that helps people quickly locate their homes relative to any geographic risks related to, say, floodplains or urban heat islands or coastal surge points is very helpful. One additional thing that I think is worth noting here, you may never provide enough data to convince everyone, and that is okay. Members of some target audiences will always ask for more numbers, data, statistics, quantitative evidence to help, often just to resolve cognitive dissonance when your data conflicts with closely held values or perspectives. This is actually a relatively small proportion of the population, even though I know sometimes it doesn't feel like it. And it might actually be growing even smaller in regions where climate change impacts are most visible. So I really recommend focusing your data presentations on the vast majority of your audience who want actionable information about how to address climate change. I'm going to end this webinar by touching briefly on visual portrayals of your data. There are professionals, and some of you may be joining us for this webinar, who blend principles of graphic design and data structure to specialize in this as a career. And this webinar is not intended to imply that you're expected now to become a data visualization expert. However, I do find it useful to keep a few principles from the field of data visualization in mind when presenting information. So when making charts, graphs, infographics, maps, or other images to convey data, always start with the story that you're telling. Don't make a chart just to add visual interest or just because you feel like there needs to be a chart. Always use it to demonstrate a key takeaway message. And also remember that visuals are often pulled from the rest of your document and widely shared alone. So you want to make sure that your visual tells a concise and clear story even without an accompanying narrative. If you must include explanatory text within or alongside your visuals, besides labeling and all the things you should have in there, limit it to brief phrases. Don't use, paragraphs because sometimes those will get edited out or taken away when people share them. And try to think about arranging your visual according to common cues, common visual cues. For example, if you want to emphasize a negative relationship or a bad outcome, place a downward-facing arrow to indicate loss and up arrows to emphasize positive associations or gains. Color can also provide powerful visual shorthand as well. Don't just choose colors because you like them, or what we often see is because they fit the visual scheme of your organization's brand. Think strategically about how people might associate colors with messages. So warm tones like oranges and yellows and reds can be used to convey heat. Blues, can be used for water-related data like sea level rise or flooding. And smoky grays can be used in visual portrayals of poor air quality. Things along those lines. When using visual shorthand, such as color and visual metaphors, it's useful to keep a couple of limitations in mind. Interpretation of these meanings may vary across cultures. So think about who your target audiences are and design visuals accordingly. And this is also the case for reading direction. If you're designing visuals that progress from left to right, it might be worth thinking about whether a lot of the members of your target audience are proficient or primarily use languages where reading direction is right to left. Just make sure that arranging your visuals according to any default reading direction doesn't profoundly change the meaning when it's quick viewed the other way. Another thing to keep in mind is that some people affected by color blindness will have a hard time distinguishing information by color. So red and green is a common one. Blues and purples are sometimes hard to distinguish. So just think about if that's a concern, you can also use gradations of color along the same spectrum. And this is an example from the Social Vulnerability Index, of that kind of color ramp. And I just want to take a moment here to single out the pie chart. This pie chart represents deaths from environmental hazards in the US, which are data some of you work with a lot. And the whole pie, of course, adds up to all deaths from hazards. And each slice of the pie is a proportion of deaths from a given type of hazards. Pie charts I know are easy to make, and most of the US population is familiar with them, but they really are not the best way of presenting your data. In this example, notice how much you have to read back and forth between the key and the chart. The other thing that it's just difficult to visually jump around and compare slices of the pie relative to one another, especially because they're not put in any sort of sequential order. I will admit, purposely used a lot of colors in this pie chart very arbitrarily because I wanted to demonstrate that this type of use of color really misses an opportunity to use color to convey meaning. So I took the same data and I put it in a bar chart. I removed the colors because I wanted to unify these data under the umbrella of deaths from hazards. They are all the same concept. and really focus on the frequency of each type of hazard, and organizing them in the order of most prevalent to least prevalent using this bar chart. And just to hammer the point home, when comparing these visuals side by side, I hope it's clear how much easier it is to quickly convey key takeaways using the bar chart compared to the pie chart. If I walked away from this bar chart, I would remember just visually, the top three are heat and drought, severe weather, and winter weather, and probably be able to recall that and communicate about it, just more quickly. And so moving on to the next few slides, I intend these just to give you some ideas to start thinking about ways to freshen up your data presentations. Again, we're not expecting, data visualization as a new career to come from this webinar. But some of these little tricks that these researchers that in the slides that followed did, I thought were kind of fun. So as with the example above, this column and bar charts are great ways to compare frequencies or proportions. These are two side-by-side versions of the same chart illustrating precipitation in terms of millimeters per day, I believe, over the month of January in 2016. And you can see that on the right, in grayscale, the authors took a very straightforward chart. But then in the chart on the left, they added some design elements to increase the visual impact. They used a blue-green color palette, or I guess rainy days, and then they added rain cloud symbols at the top of each column, depending on whether the data fell into categories of light, medium, or heavy precipitation. And you can see there's this very simple visual key at the top to clarify what different cloud images mean, heavy, medium, or light. But you probably could intuit their meaning even without the key because they correspond with the highest and lowest bars, illustrating each data point. When showing magnitudes in geographic contexts, so like this map is the projected change in freshwater stress globally in different regions around the globe through 2090. You can make bubble maps in ArcGIS to show the relative size according to geographic coordinates. And that is just a very compelling sort of snapshot that I think a lot of audiences would understand, even if they don't understand the nuances of the data, because change data is sometimes hard to explain. You can use Venn diagrams, which I thought this paper did a really interesting job to illustrate data from multiple response options. So they created categories where a single category was selected, but then another where dual categories were selected, and the dual categories, or even three categories, all three dimensions, overlap accordingly. And where there's no overlap, that's where only a single dimension was selected, social, economic, or environmental. So I thought that was a very novel and compelling way of explaining something kind of complicated. And we're coming close to closing, but I will say that line graphs are great ways to illustrate change over time. These researchers, these are the same graphs, but on the left, they presented all of their data, and then they decided that they wanted to really call out for variables. And so they allowed the rest to fade to the back while still keeping them for some context to the readers. But then they were able to really point to and compare between these four lines. And finally, shading matrices or heat maps are great ways to quickly convey color using color alone. This climate scientist assigned a color key to annual temperature data points in the contiguous US, ranging on a color scale from deep blue at the lowest temperature to dark red at the highest temperature, and then placed them side by side according to year. So this is every year since 1895 through 2017, and the annual temperature that year, which was assigned a color on a scale. And altogether, without seeing any numbers, you can quickly surmise that with a few exceptions here or there, the overall trend is toward higher temperatures of both greater frequency and intensity. And I should note that this visual happens to illustrate temperatures, but that is not where the term heat map comes from. So you can use heat maps anytime you want to use color to show differences according to magnitude. And I want to conclude by thanking you again for joining the webinar and encourage any questions for the remainder of our time. I'll also provide my email address at the end if anyone wants to reach out with additional questions on this session.
Great. Thank you so much. All right, so we've got plenty of time for questions if you have them. So please go ahead. I know a lot of information was just shared. Just so much, you know, rich information. I just loved that last section, Jenny. So thank you. Please don't miss this opportunity to ask questions about, you know, how you might apply this to your work, or questions about what was presented. We'll do our best to answer those until the top of the hour if we need to. And just a reminder, while you're thinking of what you'd like to ask, just remember that you will be receiving a recording of this webinar, as well as a couple of bonus resources that Jenny has graciously offered us, a couple of handouts related to data translation that will be provided in that follow-up email. So please keep an eye out for those. Let's see. Not seeing any questions yet, but I am hopeful, and we will we'll wait for those to come in as I have a few of my own. All right. Oh, here's one already. Perfect. Okay. Kelsey, thank you, asks, what are your favorite open source data visualization tools like ArcGIS Online, or R, and data sources like opendata.gov or US Census Bureau?
So open source data visualization is, that's a good question. It depends on the level of complexity that you would like to use in your data visualizations, but for folks that, you know, want a simple tool, Power BI allows for pretty easy and very accessible ways of translating the data into graphs and charts and things that are visually very attractive, but also pretty easy to use. So you don't need to use extremely complex platforms. You know, ArcGIS, especially for climate change data, is excellent and provides a lot of options. When using like NOAA and, you know, for environmental information, they have a lot of data tools on their climatechange.gov. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the URL offhand. They have a lot of tools in a toolkit that you can use, although I don't know about generating graphs and you know, images. I just know as data sources and very accessible data sources, I certainly would point to those. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. One of the things, this is a great question, Kelsey. They're becoming. I do know that these tools are becoming more accessible. So, like Jenny says, there are the sources for data. And also those tools to actually visualize them, which I think, as you saw, and I love the examples you gave us here, sometimes they're just really simple. You actually don't need an extra tool to do anything. It might just be manipulating the color or adding icons. I do know there's a tool called Tableau, if I'm saying that correctly, probably not. It's Tableau. It's a really popular data visualization tool. And there's, you know, a bunch of people on this webinar might actually have some other tools that they've used. So please feel free to type those into the chat and share with one another.
And in the handouts that we provide, you know, if we're asking about open sources for data, we do provide some links to mostly federal websites that have additional data that many of you may already use on a regular basis, but we have provided them just to fill in any gaps if there's interest.
Great, exactly. And I do see some more coming through. I hope that answered your question, Kelsey. Thank you, yes. Okay, and reminder to please type the questions if you can into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, though I do see some coming up in the chat. So Erica asks, with some populations, the phrase climate change leads to an automatic dismissal of anything else you might be wanting to communicate. Do you have any tips for navigating this? Can you communicate the impacts of climate change without actually calling it such? And is that advisable or just perpetuating ignorance around climate change?
That is such a good question. I'm glad it came up. Even when putting this webinar together, I had to double check to make sure that I was going to be able to use the term climate change. Like I just had to do an internal check with my audience and, you know, figured I could. Yes, I would say that, so I've done some research on this because I had the exact same question. And communicating about extreme weather doesn't do any harm. You know, if you need to communicate something and you need to couch it in the language of extreme weather, that's okay. It doesn't lose any meaning for people, you know, especially when it comes to behaviors that you're trying to recommend. You know, it's better to be sure you get your point across about dangers and risk, you know, to extreme weather events or other environmental hazards than risk losing your population that you need to communicate urgent information to by, you know, throwing in a word that will make them turn off. But I will say that using the term climate change or even climate does have, you know, it's a powerful enough word that, you know, it's worth including when you can. Again, this is about knowing your audience, but I would recommend not being afraid of the terms climate change or global warming. There are circumstances where you actually can't use those terms, and you know and those of you who operate, you know, in those environments are probably well aware of this already. But again, you don't lose anything by saying things like extreme weather and other environmental hazards. I like to say, even though it's wordy, extreme weather and environmental hazards of increasing intensity and frequency. So it gets across the idea that things are changing. It gets across the idea that there are impacts related to climate, but it is not using a trigger word that, you know, will cause people to just reject your message. I will also say that in regions where the populace tends to be more resistant to conversations about climate change, you can give them pretty much the same message, and the research indicates that if you use extreme weather, they are totally receptive to it. So, you know, they're interested in what you have to say. If it's a matter of a term, losing them, I would say, you know, it's okay to err on the side of being conservative, especially if it's about urgent information you need them to hear. But I would say whenever you can, use climate change or use climate impacts or climate related issues, you know, some term that includes climate. You know, I know now a lot of news organizations are using, you know, climate crisis. So knowing your audience, trying as much as possible to use climate change, but knowing that if you have to revert to an extreme weather conversation, you may very well still get the same point across to those more resistant audiences if you know, selectively take out climate change. I hope that helps. I know it's a little nuanced.
Yeah, thank you, Erica, for asking that question, for being the one to ask that, because I'm sure that benefits quite a few others here. And I will make a plug as well for the previous webinars in this series. We did one earlier this year with Dr. Ed Maybach from George Mason, who Dr. Kresslake has actually worked with in the past, and so does a lot, still continues to do a lot of this research on these kinds of topics. So definitely check that out if you haven't already. Great. Let's see, looking for more questions here. Daniel, just opening up the chat here. Can you talk more about how to identify target audiences? Where's a good place to start?
That's a great question. Yes, so in communication, you know, we work almost exclusively under the idea that target audiences are, you know, are where you need to start. So, so defining who they are requires a little bit of an understanding about, you know, the area, the communities, or the populations you're working in. So one thing I would suggest for climate change is, you know, I like to conceptualize target audiences according to risk factors, just because as a public health professional, that is, you know, what I need to communicate about most. But, you know, if you know in your community, for example, you have different cultural groups, you know, that, you know, either like immigrant populations or groups that are defined by culture within racial or ethnic categories, you know, populations in your community, it's best to just basically sit down and think about the demographics of your community, and, you know, start thinking about how messages might play differently according to, you know, not just sort of individual characteristics, but also you know, culturally unifying kind of elements. So I'm thinking, you know, of an example in New England. You know, there are a number of different populations of immigrant populations that live there that you need to think about for, like, linguistic differences, and then also you know, cultural norms and things that will inform how not only messages are interpreted, but also how they're talked about and disseminated, and what channels you would use to reach those target audiences. So I would say start by thinking about the composition of your community or region, just demographically, and then go down, drill down a level, and think about, you know, culturally unifying kind of groups that might have implications for your messaging. But the other thing with target audiences is, depending on what your message is, your target audiences are going to flip around and change. So again, you know, people with chronic conditions might be a target audience if your message is specifically about chronic conditions. And so you might have to think about within that, okay, I'm going to have older people, I'm going to have, you know, people with maybe children with allergies, and you really have to break it down that way. So again, you know, it's sort of an interplay between who's in your community and what your message is saying, and target audiences kind of emerge from thinking about that, you know, and that's when you're talking about the general public. But, you know, it's not just, you know, I shouldn't say the general public. When you're talking about the population, you might also, though, have to think about target audiences in terms of decision makers, or, you know, people in positions to allocate resources, or people that you need to do outreach to, like other sectors, you know, other professional sectors. And those people could be standalone target audiences, who of course would need very different messages than, say, households with young children. So, you know, in those cases, deciding, you know, I think a good start is, like, what do I want people to know? And that can help you decide, you know, broadly who you're likely going to want to see change among, and then you can start thinking about how they fall into different target audiences. And maybe if I'm missing any ideas, Meg, feel free to jump in. But it's kind of a case by case series of decisions. And I think if you know your communities pretty well, it gets a lot easier.
Yeah, I think you covered pretty much everything I would have, Jenny. So thank you. I think the only other thing I'll add there is when you're, planning your communications around particular target audiences, to use different kinds of tools and secondary research to really get to know who they are and empathize with them, which is something we already talked about already in one of the webinars that we did in this series about creative development. We talked about personas, which are descriptions of a person in your target audience. So not somebody you actually know, but just a sort of generalization of who that person is. And it's a really great way to help you step into their shoes and their situation, in addition to the thing that you're trying to communicate to them, right? Or their behavior. So it's a really nice holistic way of really getting to know who that person is that you're talking to. So do check that out if you get a chance.
One thing I will make a plug for here that showed up, I'm sure, in the earlier webinars is the Six Americas concept, which segments audiences according to their beliefs about climate change. Now, and this goes to the personas discussion that Meg was just having. You may be in a position where you have to decide, whether you want your messaging, as like with the earlier question about extreme weather versus climate change, when you're messaging, you may be in a position where you need to decide, am I going to be communicating to primarily an audience that dismisses messages about climate change, or am I going to be communicating to a very scared audience, that is really alarmed about this? You might want to define your target audiences about climate change according to those sort of personas or perspectives, but that it's kind of hard to you don't want your target audiences to be so well defined and so tiny that your messages are essentially tailored. So you might, for example, find that you're going to be communicating to an audience that is very dismissive about climate change, but they have a lot of risk factors, and so you have to make a decision. Do I prioritize their risk factors and let them know that they're at risk, or am I nervous about them dismissing my message? And so you have to think about those two things simultaneously, and and if that's a big enough audience, then it's worth designing standalone targeted messages. But if you start winnowing it down to like every little characteristic, you don't want it to get like too refined, because otherwise you don't have an audience anymore. You have a one-on-one conversation essentially.
Absolutely. Yep. All depends on the context as well. So there, for those mass outreach materials, like Jenny said, yeah, I love that. Just, looking at where the majority is, what's most important there. And there may be times when y'all are having one-on-one conversations. So right. Certainly all about context. Well, we're almost at the top of the hour here. These were really great questions. Thank you, everybody, for interacting with us and spending time with us today. We could go on and on about this topic for a long time. So thank you. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar. And before you leave, just a reminder to make sure you do look out for that follow-up email with the recording, the bonus handouts, and also a very, very short feedback questionnaire that we'd love for you to take 2 minutes to fill out. It's really helpful for us, and this is the final webinar in this series. We'd love to hear what you thought of these in general and of this one today. Dr. Kreslik has graciously offered her email up here on this screen if you have any follow-up questions for her specifically. And as well as, looking for the other recordings in this series, you can go to cdc.gov/climate and health, navigate to the resources and webinars, and you can find the rest of this series there. So thank you again to CDC, the BRACE grantees, for making this opportunity available. We really hope you enjoyed it and hope to see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.